Greetings, Carbonauts! North Star here with this week's The Lost Art of Heavy Lift Vehicles. Last week I promised you guys we would begin discussing engine clusters and staging this week, and I don't intend to disappoint. We won't be able to get to staging much this week though, so look out for the rest of that, in next week's segment. Okay, first of all, engine clusters. What are they? How do they relate to heavy launch vehicles? And why in the name of all this holy would anyone want to use them in the first place? I'm sure many of my more experienced listeners here are already familiar with engine clusters. For those of you who don't have any idea what I'm talking about, however, here's the down low on engine clusters. Engine clusters are, as the name implies, simply a grouping of engines on a rocket, usually at the bottom of a stage. What makes them unique, however, is that they're usually 1. All of the same type of engine, and 2. Evenly or symmetrically spaced around the rocket and facing in the same direction. This produces an even, unidirectional vector of thrust towards the top of the rocket, wherever other direction is intended, without causing the rocket to tip, torque, or otherwise spiral out of control and crash in the kind of magnificent fireball every Kerbal player knows and loves. Engine clusters are more than that, however. They are also an economical means to get precisely the amount of thrust you need on your rocket without having to throttle down a heavier, more expensive, and more powerful rocket engine capable of slightly more thrust than is optimal for your ascent. Further, and more importantly to heavy lift vehicles than simply saving money, engine clusters allow you to have multiple points of failure and potentially build the equivalent of a much more powerful engine out of several smaller rocket engines than could easily be achieved with a single monolithic piece of equipment. For instance, let's say you're designing a rocket in real life and want to lift a first stage fuel tank measuring 10 meters in diameter, the diameter of the historical Saturn V rocket actually. You could do this with a single massive 10-meter engine, but such an engine would be difficult to design and maintain stable combustion in while using a turbopump-fed fuel system, which is the most efficient. And furthermore, would probably be astronomically expensive to design and manufacture, even if it could be done. On the other hand, if you split that same lifting power into 5 or 6 smaller 2.5-meter rocket engines, co-opted from already existing smaller launch vehicles, you could lift your enormous rocket into orbit much more easily. Not coincidentally, this was the design logic behind both Ares 5 and the more recent Space Launch System, which uses 4 Space Shuttle main engines for its core stage propulsion. The same applies in KSP. Although we don't have to actually go through all the effort of designing, testing, and manufacturing brand new rocket engines for our spacecraft, we do have a limited selection of engine parts to work with, and some at times very massive payloads to lift into orbit using them. This is where engine clusters come in. By simply sticking a whole bunch of smaller engines on the bottom of our spacecraft, we can lift that enormous 12-meter core stage we built with procedural parts into orbit using nothing but 3.75-meter rocket engines. Even a simple 3.75-meter fuel tank can sometimes be launched more efficiently using a cluster of 1.25-meter rocket engines than using a single 3.75-meter engine. Ultimately, it all depends on how much thrust you need and how much surface area you have on the bottom of your rocket to work with as to what is the most efficient engine layout. So how do we build engine clusters then? Do we just stack a bunch of rocket engines all haphazard in the bottom of a rocket and hope it will fly straight? Absolutely not. Instead, we start the process of building an engine cluster with a design in mind beforehand. The best designs to work with, and often easiest to imagine in the first place, are often those simply based on well-known geometrical designs. Have 4 rocket engines? Place them in a square. 3, a triangle. 5, pentagon. 12, I hope you know what a dodecagon looks like. Basically, the more rocket engines you're adding, the closer you come to placing them in a perfect circle. And if you're really using smaller engines or hurting for room, concentric circles are often the way to go. At the very least, anything larger than about a pentagon usually has space in the middle for a single centrally placed engine as well as the outer ring. This all begs the question though, How many engines do we need? That obviously depends on the size of your payload, first of all, and the pattern of your staging, a topic we'll get to next week. However, the key thing with any rocket is always the thrust-to-weight ratio. I nearly gagged when I heard J. Author's piece on heavy lift vehicles 10 episodes ago, and I bet Tchaikovsky and Goddard are both turning in the graves after their episode. Sorry, J. Author. You see, large rockets are not necessarily slow rockets. Just because your rocket weighs 1.5 kilotons on the launch pad doesn't mean that it should take any longer to reach orbit than a rocket weighing only 50 metric tons, or accelerate any slower. In fact, the larger a rocket is, the faster its ideal ascent velocity is at any given altitude. You see, bigger is better when it comes to rockets, at least in aerodynamic terms. Larger objects inherently have higher ballistic coefficients, meaning they encounter relatively less air resistance compared to their mass if they have the same shape and density as a small object they being compared to. This is because they have less surface area, as all larger objects do due to the square cube law. This means that the ideal ascent velocity of a larger rocket is faster because air resistance is less of an issue for larger rockets, and gravity drag, or the amount of energy expended holding a rocket up with thrust before it reaches orbital velocity and can be allowed to free fall without re-entering the atmosphere, is still proportional to total mass in just the same way as with a smaller rocket. The optimal thrust-to-weight ratio at any point during a large rocket's ascent is thus actually slightly higher than that of a smaller rocket with similar shape at most points during its ascent profile, and the optimal ascent curve is more horizontal rather than less compared to a smaller rocket with a lower ballistic coefficient. In practical terms, this means when designing a large rocket, you are often going to be hard-pressed to find enough surface area in the bottom to fit all the necessary thrust onto rocket for its optimal ascent curve. This is where side-mounted boosters and more complex types of staging really shine, topics we'll get to in future segments. In particular, without spoiling too much for next week, it is helpful to find designs that allow you to keep relatively more of your thrust until later during your ascent, trading off initially suboptimal thrust-to-weight ratio early in the ascent for slightly higher than ideal thrust-to-weight ratio later in the ascent, averaging a closer to optimal thrust-to-weight ratio overall than if you simply shed engines at the same rate as fuel tanks throughout your entire ascent and started with a suboptimal ratio. My voice is getting tired, and I'm sure your ears are too. So until next time, this is North Star signing off. May you always fly safe and find a star at true north to guide you home.